domestic repression. That's a lot. We'll have a conversation with him. You'll have an opportunity to ask questions in the chat, and we can relay your questions. I want to just review a couple of things first, and that is the norms. So please show respect at all times. Try to stay on topic in the chat and agree or disagree agreeably. All right, with that, let's go to Medea for a news update.
Well, it's been a busy couple of days for us in the Congress. It seems like this is a time this week where you see a particular takeover of our Congress by these pro-Israel groups. This last 2 days have been a group called Christian Leaders for Israel, as well as other groups. In fact, their signs were rabbis and pastors for Israel. And they have all these private events. I don't know how they do it. They had a private screening last night in the Capitol, in the Visitor Center, of a documentary called October 8th. I don't know if any of you have seen it, but it's about the students being harassed after October 7th. And I hear it's on Netflix, but you got to pay 20 bucks. I'm going to see it just because I'm curious, but I went to see it and was kicked out of the room because they didn't want me in there, even though it's the people's house. And today a similar thing happened. They had two private events. They are guarded by about 10 different police officers. We stood out there with holding pita bread, which is our new thing now, saying, let the children eat. Bread, not bombs, let the children eat. And we were going up and down the halls of Congress saying to these people, you're condoning the starvation of the children of Gaza. And, that brings me to what is happening right now, which is 63 days now that Israel has not let in one truck full of aid. We have been on calls with Doctors Against Genocide who have had people on those calls directly from Gaza saying that the health system is absolute in collapse, that they can't do anything for their cancer patients, for their dialysis patients, for premature babies. And they're not only running out of medicines and food, but they're running out of fuel, which will mean, they can't even keep the incubators on. In the meantime, Israel has announced massive new intensified operations. It's calling up tens of thousands of reservists, and it is talking about a really, really dystopian, we think things can't get worse, and if Israel goes through with this, it's going to get worse. They're talking about a massive relocation of the people to what's called sterile zones that include hubs that are protected by, guess what? Armed U.S. security contractors who will be the ones that will distribute, quote, aid, but only to those Palestinians that are vetted by Israel, and they will use facial recognition. They want to get a, quote, ceasefire and hostages released before Trump's visit to the Middle East, which is May 13th. He's going to Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and the UAE, showing our great support for human rights, because all of those countries are terrible human rights violators. But anyway, Hamas has rejected their proposal because it doesn't include an eventual withdrawal of troops from Gaza and an end to the war. So this new intensified occupation of Gaza has been condemned by the largest hostage family group. It's also been condemned by the UN and by the humanitarian organizations that say that the scheme, the diabolical scheme they have for distribution, is a violation of humanitarian principles of impartiality, independence, and neutrality. Oxfam said, we would never support a model that treats civilians as prisoners. Oh, and the two companies, by the way, that would be in charge of this are the one called Safe Reach Solutions, and the other is UG Solutions. And they are run by people who were CIA and Green Beret. So it is truly a dystopian, catastrophic, what's already happened, but what they have in the works right now. I don't think that we're going to go anywhere with more support for the aid issue right now, except that Trump is saying we got to get some food in. But this model is one that is totally unacceptable. And there is a letter that's been circulating in the House that many of us, and hopefully many of you on the call, have been pushing, even though the wording is not what we would like. But still, it was introduced by very moderate Democrats, including Marcy Winograd's congressperson, Salud Carvajal, and Ami Bera. And it has over 80 members of Congress. They've extended it now until Wednesday, tomorrow, at the end of the day. So we're putting a lot of effort into getting signatures on that, as well as asking individual members of Congress, and this is something you can all do, to put out statements saying that the situation is dire and that Israel has to let food in. And finally, I want to say, leave you on a little bit more of a positive note, which is that we had a meeting with Marjorie Taylor Greene today, who I'm sure many of you dislike for many things about her, but she is one of the only anti-war people now that are against war in general. And in the Republican Party, she is pushing Trump, saying the American people don't want to go to war with Iran. She says that she's not in favor of continuing to support Israel. She is she has the ear of Trump. And so we have been talking to her about the need for people to come together of different ideologies. I don't even think we can even call it left and right anymore. And she said, well, she's going to be on the Young Turks tonight. And we also had an example of that kind of merging yesterday when our friend Ben Cohen from Ben and Jerry's was on Tucker Carlson's show and did a fabulous job. I was on Judge Napolitano's show yesterday, and you might know him for being a commentator on Fox News for many years. So this is an interesting time to try to push aside our ideologies and our disagreements on some issues and really come together on the issue of stopping the support for Israel.
Thank you so much for all of that information and analysis. Medea, what about the flotilla? It was droned, wasn't it? And Tig is over there with Ann Wright in Malta.
Yes, my partner Tig just got home today. This is unbelievable how Israel can get away with exploding a civilian vessel that's in international waters off of Malta. This is part of a tradition that goes back to 2008 of people trying to break the siege of Gaza by sea. Some of you might recall in 2010 how Israeli Navy commandos boarded the ship and killed 10 people on board. This time, they blew it up from a C-130 aircraft that was hovering and seen hovering and reported in CNN over where the ship was at the time that these drones were released. It seems they were released from the cargo ship. And we are calling for an investigation and also for the government of Malta to allow the ship to come into port, to be repaired, to give us the flag to sail, and to continue on its voyage to Gaza. So the end of this saga is not over yet.
Yes, and I have a feeling it might have been Israel that droned that flotilla. I even read that somewhere, I think I don't know, was it Reuters or some outfit, it might have been the Times of Israel that said Channel 12 in Israel said it was Israel that drone bombed.
Well, it was an Israeli plane that was flying overhead, and they have said that it's capable of dropping drones from the plane.
Speaking of you mentioned a left-right alliance. I urge everybody to watch Bernie Sanders and Rand Paul, Chris Murphy. There are clips of the hearing on the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act, which would, well, as originally written, adopt the examples of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance to assert that someone has uttered an anti-Semitic statement, is anti-Semitic, and would lead to federal civil rights complaints, defunding of schools. 7 of the 11 examples revolve around Israel. Well, it was just a brilliant maneuver by Bernie and Rand Paul. And you got to catch it because Bernie introduced an amendment to take out all of the examples that were critical of Israel. In other words, you can't say somebody's anti-Semitic because they criticize Israel. Well, the chair of the committee tried to table that, so they could move on. And he was not able to. And Rand Paul and Bernie, they won.
Well,
So
and we should say for the moment that hasn't left committee. It's not going to come to the floor, which is wonderful, as well as the horrible bill that is around boycott, divestment, and sanctions that could make it up to a year in prison and $1 million fine. And that, thanks to Marjorie Taylor Greene, who said it was terrible, and Tom Massey, they pulled that as well. We never see the end of these bills. They keep coming back again, but so far, those are two good examples of opposition from the Democrats and Republican sides to stop two terrible bills from going through.
yes, and while we're talking about, there's an effort, from what I'm hearing in California, to adopt the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance examples, to codify those, to give people more ammunition to file complaints with the Department of Education. So as much as we focus on what's happening on Capitol Hill, and thank you so much, Medea, for being there, we also need to take a look at what's happening in our state legislatures. What are our state lawmakers, and it doesn't matter if they're Republican or Democrat, what are they doing to cover up, deny, or worse, justify Israel's genocide in Gaza? A couple of other news items I just want to mention before we go to our guest, Chip Gibbons. President Trump announced the United States is abandoning its daily bombing campaign of Yemen. He says he's going to stop bombing Yemen with the understanding that the Houthis will agree to a ceasefire between Washington and Yemen. Meanwhile, some of the political voices in the Ansar Allah movement say they're going to continue to stop the navigation of weapons to Israel, though they won't be targeting U.S. ships. So we'll see how that goes. In the meantime, a lot of people are watching what's happening between India and Pakistan. Both are nuclear armed nations, and the Indian military has launched strikes against Pakistan. This is in retaliation for last month's attack in Indian administered Kashmir. So that's a very tense situation. All right, Medea, please introduce our guest.
Yes, well, it gives me great pleasure to introduce a wonderful friend of mine, Chip Gibbons. He is Policy Director for Defending Rights and Dissent, and that is a national civil liberties organization that defends people's rights to know and freedom to act through grassroots mobilization, public education, policy expertise, and advocacy journalism. At Defending Rights and Dissent, Chip educates members of Congress about the Constitution. They need that.
They do.
They do. And edits the Gaza First Amendment Alert. A journalist and researcher focusing on U.S. national security state, Chip is currently working on a book called The Imperial Bureau. And his most recent piece is Mahmoud Khalil's Battle Is Not Over, which he wrote for Jacobin. So thank you so much for being with us, Chip. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Medea, and it's good to be on with you. You are also a good friend of mine, so it is an honor to join us tonight. So I'm going to talk about some of the free expression issues stemming from the current Gaza genocide. So back in October, the United Nations Special Rapporteur on the promotion and protection of the right to freedom of opinion and expression, Irene Khan, she told the United Nations General Assembly that with the Gaza war has unleashed a global crisis of freedom of expression, and that rarely has a conflict challenged freedom of opinion and expression so broadly and so far beyond its own borders. We've obviously seen that in this country. We've heard about two very bad bills tonight, the International Non-Governmental Organization Boycott Act, as well as the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act, both of which would have curtailed core free expression rights, both of which we've been fighting at DRAD for about 10 years, I feel like. And since the launch of the Gaza war, the U.S. has clearly been witnessing the worst crisis for civil liberties since the immediate period after 9/11 and early in George Bush's war on terror. with Trump at the helm, this crisis is now starting to resemble the McCarthy era or the Palmer raids or these earlier periods in U.S. history that are even worse than then. And I think we have to take a step back and remember this didn't start with Trump. It didn't even start with Biden. There has long been a Palestine exception to the First Amendment in this country, and it is this Palestine exception to the First Amendment that has enabled Donald Trump's authoritarianism. When we look at the attacks on immigrants' rights, the attacks on universities, the attacks on free speech broadly, it has all mostly been through the guise of attacking the right to oppose Israel or support Palestine. So without this free speech exception for Palestinian rights, Trump would not have this vector of authoritarianism. So if you're in the anti-Trump resistance, my advice to you is that you cannot have rallies that call for hands off NATO, but say nothing about hands off Gaza, because the authoritarianism of Trump is very much tied to the war making in the Middle East. So there's a lot happening, but I want to talk about the current attacks on the international students. We've seen sort of two types of attacks on international students, largely under the helm of Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, who was confirmed unanimously by the US Senate, including by Bernie Sanders. We see this one set of attacks that I'm not going to talk about, but I'm going to acknowledge. And these are students who are being accused of having some sort of criminal record or arrest and are having their visas revoked without due process. In many of the cases, they're quite low level or absurd. I heard a story about someone who was cited for fishing, and he caught too many fish. You can only catch so many fish while fishing, and he had his visa revoked over that. Or somebody else from Spain, where the drinking age is much lower than this country, who got a ticket for underage drinking. And I believe they are backing off on that. But in addition to that, we have seen students clearly targeted for engaging in criticism of Israel or support for the Palestinian people. Axios has reported the existence of a program called Catch and Revoke. And this is a whole of government initiative led by the State Department, but involving DHS. And remember, ICE, CBP, these are all parts of DHS and DOJ, and the FBI is a part of DOJ that is aimed at going after students who are on visas, who have spoken out for Palestine or against Israel's genocide in Gaza, and revoking those visas, detaining them, and deporting them. And one of the most fascinating and disturbing things about this program is exactly how targets are being selected. The big headline we heard a lot about was the use of artificial intelligence. Now, I'm very skeptical of artificial intelligence, but they're claiming they're using artificial intelligence to find students who have posted on social media since October the 7th, quote unquote, social media conduct glorifying terrorism. Obviously, I don't condone glorifying terrorism, but we know when Trump and Rubio talk about glorifying terrorism, they include in that category any opposition to Israeli policy, any opposition to US policy. So this is clearly about using artificial intelligence to surveil social media en masse, find people who have committed thought crimes, and subject them to immigration process. And even if you have no sympathy to international students or people who are being deported or whatever, and I don't think that's true of this call, but imagine what a terrible precedent we are setting, where we are allowing the government to develop a technology that can find people online who have engaged in First Amendment protected conduct that the government does not like and subject them to a penalty. Today, it's immigration enforcement, but what's to stop it from being an IRS investigation or an FBI investigation or any of these other things? Besides AI, we know that targets are being selected per the reporting Axios based off of news articles about political protest, about lawfare suits, these various anti-Palestinian, anti-First Amendment groups who file false civil rights claims against universities or students, arguing that supporting Palestine is anti-Semitism. These lawsuits are being used to find the names of people. And we also have heard from this sort of private McCarthyite complex, groups like Batar, who I think many of us are unfortunately familiar with, Canary Mission, that they are boasting that they are providing targets to the State Department, to DHS, to Trump. And we have seen in some of these cases, the students who have been selected for deportation have been on Canary Mission, or they have been Batar, this followers of Jabotinsky. I don't know how many people on this call even know who Jabotinsky was. I think I would use my whole 10 minutes trying to explain that, so I'm not going to. But I'll just say this. In the 30s, the other Zionist thought Jabotinsky was a fascist. And these people are his proud followers. And right now at Defending Rights and Dissent, we are engaged in an investigative project using the Freedom of Information Act. We have filed like over a dozen of Freedom of Information Act requests with DHS, with ICE, with the FBI to try to get their communications with groups like Canary Mission, with Batar, to see if Batar is showing up in FBI investigations, if they're showing up in DHS profiles of people to be deported. Although that is a very challenging thing, and I can talk more about that during the Q&A. And I would suspect that the FBI, who we know is part of the catch and revoke program, is also helping to select targets. And I'll just point out that throughout the history, going back to the Palmer raids, which is how J. Edgar Hoover got his start with the FBI has manipulated or abused immigration enforcement to accomplish political speech or suppressing political speech. And I had a piece in Jacobin early this year where I looked at 3 instances where the FBI did this: the Palmer raids, the deportation proceedings against Harry Bridges, a labor organizer in the 30s, as well as the deportations provisions against the Los Angeles Eight, who were pro-Palestine supporters, and how in each of these cases, what started as an attack on immigrants and immigrants' rights pre-configured a wider attack on free expression, which is not to say we shouldn't care about the rights of immigrants, but I'm just saying if you think the Trump administration, at the behest of the Israeli lobby, turning criticizing Israel into an actionable, a legally actionable thing, will end with just immigrants, it's not. It's going to be much broader. And then the law that's being used here is very interesting. It's a McCarthy era law where the Secretary of the State can have someone thrown out of the country if he, quote unquote, has reasonable grounds to believe that person's presence here would have serious adverse foreign policy consequences for the United States. The reasons that have been given for some of these attempts to deport people has been that protesting against Israel is anti-Semitic, and therefore the U.S. has a foreign policy to oppose anti-Semitism, and therefore by having people in this country who protest Israel, they're undermining that policy. They also perversely claim that Moshe Modawe was a threat to the peace process. And then I could talk a little bit more about some of the specific cases and the different legal mechanisms behind them. But I think I'm probably at time at this point, and they're rather complicated things. So I'll just leave it to if anyone has questions and answers. I'm happy to get more into what's happening in Mahmoud Halil's case, or what's happening in Mohsen Modawe's case, or what's the difference between having Rubio come after you when you're a student visa holder or a green card holder, or any of those things. I will note it's been very confusing because these cases are both in immigration court. And for people who don't know, immigration courts are not what's called an Article 2 court, meaning they're not part of the federal judiciary. They are technically part of the executive branch. The immigration judges literally work for the Department of Justice, meaning Pam Bondi is their boss. Whereas federal courts are the types of courts we all know and love. Sometimes we don't love them very much, but they are at the very least supposedly supposed to be a neutral venue. And that's where you see this sort of strange thing where you'll have a judge in New Jersey hearing Mahmoud Halil's habeas petition, and I can talk about what that is. And then you'll have a former ICE lawyer who now works for the Department of Justice, who we call a judge in Louisiana, saying Mahmoud Halil can be deported. So it's a very technical set of laws.
Thank you so much, Chip. We really appreciate hearing your insights. You have so much expertise in this area. I have a couple of questions. One, I've been reading that, at least in California, at the University of California, there have been 10 to 12 students at different UC campuses whose visas were revoked and now have been restored. I don't know if it's because the Trump administration feels the pressure from the courts or what. So that's one question. The other question is the FOIA request that you mentioned. You know, I submitted a FOIA request and it took me 6 years to get it, to get a response. It was in the National Archives, I guess, because it was such a long time ago. But is it your experience that you get these responded to in a timely manner?
No, no one gets FOIA requests responded to in a timely manner. I wrote a story for The Intercept that was about the FBI surveillance of the International Solidarity Movement, a nonviolent, peaceful pro-Palestinian group. The FBI opened multiple investigations into them, one of which I love because I got the FBI's agents' handwritten notes in the file. And the handwritten notes in the side were just no evidence, like no evidence of anything wrong. I thought that was very funny. Not that they did this investigation, but that they were admitting they had no evidence beyond First Amendment protected speech. In that case, what I did was I sued the FBI. And Defending Rights and Dissent is prepared to sue these different agencies to compel the release of the documents. The FOIA statute is quite strict. If the government does not release the document in 20 days, you have a right to go to court and ask for them to be released. Now, the legal process is very, very slow as well, but it is faster than some of these FOIA requests, where what I've seen happen is the FBI never, ever assign someone to process the request. So, for example, I have been part of lawsuits that have released the documents about spying on the pro-Palestine protesters. I'm part of a lawsuit that is forcing the FBI to finally release the file of the informant at the center of the Fred Hampton assassination. Defending Rights and Dissent was part of that. And we've been part of a lawsuit that has released a bunch of FBI files Medea, that mentioned global exchange and the World Trade Organization protest in the early 90s and early 2000s, where I have discovered that the FBI in August and September of 2001 were investigating anarchists who might protest the World Bank. They even had the airports on high alert for anarchists at the airports. And this investigation is ended on September the 12th, 2001, when the agent is reassigned to the 9/11 case. So we can get information out of it, and we are prepared to sue DHS, State Department, the rest of them. We have been fundraising for this. We've been talking to lawyers. We will go to the mat on this issue. Right now, we're still figuring out which FOIA request are best we could get something out of, which ones are ripe for litigation, which ones are smart to litigate. I've had a number of interesting experiences with talking to a FOIA officer over the phone for one of these agencies. I'm not going to say which one. It's not the FBI, who is weirdly supportive, and I don't know, maybe she's leading me, or I'm not going to give any information about them. Maybe they're leading me on. And they will call me like, oh, I just started reading about Maud Halil's case. If you're looking for information on Batar, I suggest you FOIA this. And maybe they're leading me, maybe they're leading me astray, maybe not. So I am hoping to get information out of this. The other thing that we're, I think, going to do this summer when we have a legal fellow is start FOIAing the 80 fusion centers in this country. And in the past, through FOIAing fusion centers, we've been able to, hello, my cat is meowing at me. It does not like what I'm saying. Marcus, I don't like the fusion center either.
Tell us about what do you mean by the fusion center? And
So yes, I'm going to.
About the visas too.
So the fusion centers are run by DHS. They're at the state level. They fuse together different bodies. They share intelligence between the FBI, local police, different federal agencies, private agencies. I believe that their intelligence is notoriously very shoddy, and just they amass a bunch of information about U.S. Citizens' rights. They're one of these sorts of nebulous entities that result in exchanges between federal and local law enforcement. You also have the FBI Joint Terrorism Task Forces, where local police act as FBI agents. In some cases, other Other federal agents act as FBI agents. So when we have a little bit more staffing this summer with a legal fellow, we are going to start FOIAing all 80 of the fusion centers. And the past through FOIAing fusion centers, through FOIAing local police, we've actually have gotten FBI documents. A former colleague of mine wrote a story about, I believe it was FBI surveillance of environmental protesters, and they were able to get these documents out of a fusion center. So we are FOIAing state, treasury, FBI, ICE. We're hitting up the fusion centers. We're going to hit up the local police departments. We are going to cover as wide as ground as possible with these FOIA requests. And we are prepared to litigate a select number of them. With the visa question, I have seen this reporting, and it's very unclear to me which of the visas that have been restored are for people who like engaged in fishing without a license or engaged in drinking at 19, which if you're Spanish, you're probably shocked to discover is not allowed, versus the people who are being hit under the Rubio thing. As far as I know, none of the politically motivated cases based on the Rubio thing, like the tough student whose name is escaping me at this moment, the Columbia students have been rescinded.
Ozturk.
We'll
Thank
find
you.
out. I'll find out. I'll ask some questions. Medea.
Those are good questions.
So I have so many questions for you, but I'm going to start with two that are in our chat from Laura Gibney. One is, if we use Chinese AI, such as DeepSeek, are we still at risk for surveillance by the US government? And the other one she asks is, when the US deports people for speech or political actions, are they able also to confiscate their assets in the United States?
Sure. So those are both two really good questions. So with the AI, the issue is not that we're using AI, it's that the government's using AI. I suspect Marco Rubio is not using the Chinese DeepSeek. Maybe he is. That'd be quite funny. But the problem isn't that you or I are using ChatGPT or Grok or DeepSeek and the government is spying on us. Is that the government is developing artificial intelligence technology to go through social media and find people's political views. So even if you don't use AI at all, you would still be subjected to this surveillance. I don't know the answer about confiscation of property. I don't necessarily think they are able to do that. I know there is civil asset forfeiture in some cases, but you would have to be accused of something beyond just being deported, I believe. I'm not actually an expert in immigration law. My specialty is the First Amendment and, the U.S. dropping bombs on people and taking away our rights to criticize them for doing so. Immigration law is it's not my field. I can ask somebody. My belief is no. There are various things they can do if you're accused of supporting terrorism to freeze your assets and things like that using sort of OFAC sanctions. But I'm not aware of anyone who has just had their possessions confiscated absent any sort of charge beyond being removable from the country.
So I had a question about the Alien Enemies Act, and now it seems as if there are two judges that have said that this is unlawful to be used as part of deportation. So does that make you feel hopeful?
Well, the Trump administration's use of the Alien Enemies Act was always on very legally shaky ground. The Alien Enemies Act is from John Adams, the time of John Adams, which was a long time ago, before my time, actually. I think before all of our times. And it is very specific in the text of it that it applies to a declared war with a foreign government or a predatory invasion or incursion by a foreign government. The Trump administration tried to tie this Venezuelan gang to the Venezuelan government, which we now know through a Freedom of Information Act request from Freedom of the Press Foundation and from various reporting that the US government does not believe this gang is controlled by the Venezuelan government. And certainly the Venezuelan government is not using this gang to invade us. And if we think for a second about what Trump is saying, that would mean we were in a war with Venezuela, which I know we are in an economic war. I know we are doing regime change. We are not formally in a war with Venezuela. So Trump does not really have a leg to stand on with the Alien Enemies Act cases. And the hearings have always been very clear that this isn't about whether or not you can deport these people, but whether or not you can deport them under this law without these processes. With the student deportation cases, I would remind people that there was a group of people in the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s known as the Los Angeles Eight, who were 7 Palestinians, 2 of which were permanent residents, I believe, and one of their Kenyan wives, who were accused of supporting the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, a Marxist-Leninist Palestinian faction that supports one secular socialist state in all of historic Palestine, and of course has engaged in armed actions like hijackings and things like that that most of the world would say is, meets the definition of terrorism, to be honest. And they were accused of providing political support for them, which at the time was not a crime. It was before the Clinton era terror law. And in the midst of this 20-some year deportation proceeding, Congress passes a law that strips the courts of hearing a lot of and again, this is where I'm going to flag for you that I am not an immigration expert, where that removes the ability of courts to hear a lot of actions by the attorney general to deport people. And the American Arab Anti-Discrimination Committee takes this case to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court rules, I believe 8-1, that under this law passed by Congress, that you cannot challenge your deportation on the basis of selective enforcement or selective prosecution. And then since then, Congress passed the Real ID Act, which I believe further limits the abilities of courts to hear challenges to immigration enforcement proceedings initiated by the Attorney General. Now, these proceedings are not being initiated by the Attorney General. They're being initiated by the Secretary of State. And when I said that things like the Mahmoud Halil and the Moshe Madali cases are very technical, a lot of the arguments in the briefs are about whether or not that court stripping measure passed by Congress applies to actions of the Secretary of State, or if, the plain meaning of the statute, Attorney General, means Attorney General. There's also various other arguments in which the U.S. government is claiming that the Secretary of State's determination that your presence in this country poses what is an adverse consequence for U.S. foreign policy, whatever the obtuse language is, then that is a political question. And the Supreme Court has always been clear, political questions are not reviewable by the courts. So if something is considered a political question, then the courts can't even consider the issue. So that's another one of the arguments, that Rubio can do this and a court can't look at it, which, will remind you of the George Bush years where, Bush was kidnapping Americans out of the Chicago O'Hare Airport and sticking them in a brig. And I think, was it North or South Carolina? I'm talking about Jose Padilla, of course, and then saying courts can't hear this.
Chip, I'm wondering about the FBI. I know you're deep into a book about the FBI. I wonder how competent the FBI is in its persecution of activists and record keeping. I mentioned how I had submitted a FOIA request, took me 6 years. And when I read the FBI file on me, I had to laugh. They misspelled my name throughout the file. They said I had a boyfriend in Europe. Never. They called the University of California to try to get my student records. And the guy at Berkeley at Sproul Plaza said, "I'm sorry, do you have a warrant?" And
good for him. I like him. Right? I like this man. I don't know.
Funny because my parents said to me, "Marcy, a friend of yours called from New York and wanted to know how to reach you." And I'm like, "What friend from New York would call me?" It was the FBI.
Well, I think you raise a very interesting issue in that the FBI both engages in incredibly intrusive surveillance, but they're also not always totally competent. I think the FBI hounded Martin Luther King, right? They put wiretaps and microphones in his personal hotel rooms. They tried to blackmail him into killing himself. They said, well, he must be a communist. And if you're a communist, you're not allowed to speak in this country. Therefore, we can find information about his personal, conduct with other adults and blackmail him based on that. A really vicious, intrusive surveillance. But other parts of the FBI's files are debates that an informant picked up in the Michigan Communist Party about whether or not Martin Luther King's sermons show the influence of Hegel. I have no idea if his sermons show the influence of Hegel or not, and I suspect this FBI informant did not as well. Or there's literally something in one of the initial FBI documents where they are deciding whether or not to open the communist infiltration to see if he's been influenced by communist investigation into him, where they're getting reports from an informant in the Buffalo Workers World Party chapter. No shade on the Buffalo Workers World Party. I'm sure they're lovely people, but has never met King, has no insight into King. I don't know if Martin Luther King ever went to Buffalo, and I don't know if this guy ever went to Atlanta, but they have an informant in the chapter, and they're reporting what this random person thinks about him. And so you get stuff like that mixed in with stuff like, we have wiretaps of relationships with people who aren't your wife, and we think you should kill yourself. So, I mean, the FBI is really good at mixing together intrusive, horrendous, life-destroying surveillance along with, comical ineptitude.
Chip,
But yeah.
okay, a question and then back to Medea. So, these are such upside down times, and the Trump administration, we might think of it as a monolith, but we know that there's infighting. And we just saw Mike Waltz fired as national security advisor, although now he's put at the UN. Medea brought up earlier, well, he's just taking orders. And this was over Trump not wanting to go to war against Iran. And yet, he's overseeing all of these arrests of pro-Palestinian protesters, 2,000-pound bombs to Gaza. So make it make sense. It doesn't make sense. But my question is this, my understanding is that the McCarthy hearings came to a halt after Joe McCarthy accused the FBI of being communist.
It was the army. It was the army.
Okay.
The army of being communist.
Can you envision that?
McCarthy had a really great relationship with the FBI for the most part. There's a very famous quote from Ellen Schrecker, who is considered the preeminent historian of McCarthyism. And they actually cite one of her articles in the habeas case setting motion modality free. The judge compares what Trump is doing to the Palmer raids and to the McCarthy deportations, and he cites a Alan Schrecker piece. And there's a very famous quote from her definitive history of McCarthyism, many of the crimes. It said, if his people had the Freedom of Information Act in the 50s or whenever, and they knew what we knew now, instead of calling it McCarthyism, they would have called it Hooverism. And long before Joseph McCarthy was ever a senator, J. Edgar Hoover was going after communism, and he was setting sort of the groundwork for the McCarthy era repression that then takes place when the Cold War happens. And I actually think there's a really, not to get off task, but I think there's a really interesting parallel there between what the FBI does in the 90s and post 9/11. During the 90s, the FBI is hounding supporters of Palestinian rights like Samuel Arian, the Holy Land Foundation, and also Global Exchange. They didn't like Global Exchange, but I'm sorry to inform you, the FBI was not a fan. And they are going after them. And then after September the 11th, well, they actually go back before September 11th, they lie in something like 75 FISA warrants to the FISA court, which has their surveillance powers slightly curtailed as a result of it. And those were about Palestinian supporters. But then after 9/11, what are the big war on terror prosecutions? Holy Land Foundation, accused of giving humanitarian support to children in Gaza who did not attack us on 9/11. Samuel Arian, who is accused of supporting Palestine, not falsely, but the crimes he's accused of are false. He does support Palestine, and he is deported after a plea deal. They go back after the LA8, and they bring a criminal prosecution of Mohammed Salah, the first person ever, a U.S. citizen ever designated a special designated terrorist who they had gone after under the Clinton administration, and who was tortured by Israel with the aid of Judith Miller, the infamous New York Times Iraq war reporter. She actually went to Israel when they were detaining Mohammed Salah, a U.S. citizen, and participated in the interrogation, and then ran a story on the front page of the New York Times about how Arab Americans were supporting Hamas based off of this torture interrogation. So it is. I would love to say more, Nancy Nelson, about the Holy Land Five, but I suspect you could probably read Mike Pilo's book, Injustice. It's a very good book. But again, sort of analogous, right? The FBI had an anti-communist program that becomes sort of the guiding force of the domestic Cold War. The FBI has an anti-Palestinian program that becomes sort of the front line of the so-called war on terror at home.
So, one, I just want to say that, I could listen to you all night because you're so full of information. It's really fantastic. I'm going to throw a couple of questions at you. You can answer whichever ones you want because we don't have all that much time left. And I'm taking some of the ones that were in the chat. One is that people want to know, why was Mohsen Madawi released and the other one's not? People want to know, who has constitutional rights and due process in the United States? Do you have to be a U.S. citizen? And then there's two questions about Code Pink. One is, can we sue the members of Congress who are committing libel against us by saying that we take money from the Chinese Communist Party? And the other is, what is the status of the FBI investigating Code Pink? This is from Cynthia Papermaster in the Bay Area, who has been accused by Nancy Pelosi of being supported by the Chinese Communist Party, and has been told to go back to her headquarters in China.
Well, I won't answer what Code Pink should do, but the question of who has due process rights, everyone has due process rights in the US. The Constitution limits the federal government, it does not grant rights. Anyone in the US has due process or First Amendment rights. It is much easier to revoke someone's visa than take someone's green card. And if you are a green card holder or permanent resident, under US law, under the US statute, you are what is known as a US person, and you have almost identical rights. Obviously, you can't vote to a US citizen. So permanent residents are, for purposes of US law, a US person. So in theory, these individuals should have the same rights as you and I. As far as why was Madawi released and the other one's not, that's a really great question. So what's happening is that there are two, at least in Halil and Madawi's cases, there are two tracks of litigation. There's what's called a habeas petition, and a habeas petition is a petition that argues you're being illegally detained. And the habeas petitions are used in a variety of cases. So like if you're on death row and you think there was a flaw with your trial, you file a habeas petition against your warden to challenge the initial conviction. So the Supreme Court has said that if you're being detained under the Alien Enemies Act, you file a habeas petition. So technically, they are petitions that argue you're being illegally held, but they're being used in these cases to raise First Amendment issues. As the New Jersey judge who has the Halil habeas petition has not made a ruling yet about that petition. In Louisiana, an immigration judge heard his case and ruled he's deportable or removable, even though a judge has not ruled on the constitutional challenge. And immigration courts can't hear constitutional challenges. In the Madawi case, a judge has granted bail based on a precedent in a case called Mapp v. Janet Reno, arguing that because he has such a high merits of succeeding on his habeas petition, and remember, this is outside the immigration proceeding, which is still ongoing, he should be granted bail. They also argued there was an extraordinary set of circumstances that justified bail, including an atmosphere like those of the Palmer raids. So the biggest answer is just different judges.
But it's also that in the case of Mohsen, his lawyers were ready when he went in there and filed a case for him before they could whisk him away to Louisiana or Texas, as they did to the others. And of course, they want to get them to Louisiana and Texas because they will be with judges who are very unfavorable. In the case, and I wanted to give you an update because it just came out a few minutes ago, that the Georgetown University researcher, who some of you might have heard about his case, Badr Khansoudi, some of us were at his hearing the other day. He wasn't there because he is in Louisiana, but they ruled that the judge just ruled now that his case has to be heard in Virginia. And that's extremely important and good. And that it's likely that she will order the audit that he be returned. Oh, he's in Texas, not Louisiana. That he be returned as she continues to hear the legal merits of the case, and hopefully could get him out on bail as well. So that's just another, in addition to what you were saying, I think it's,
Yeah.
are they able to stop them from being sent out of state before they do?
And the Halil case is very strange because you have an immigration judge ruling on his case in Louisiana, and then you have a New Jersey federal judge weighing the habeas petition to release him, and two different federal judges, a New York judge and a New Jersey judge, have both said New Jersey is the proper venue for the habeas petition. So you literally have a petition to challenge his detention that two federal courts have said should be heard in New Jersey, and then you have an immigration proceeding happening at the same time in Louisiana, which is the basis for it's very, very bizarre.
Yeah, I also want to add that in the case of Badr Khansoudi, who is from Georgetown, who has not received as much publicity as the others, he was not any kind of leader in any kind of movement. In fact, what we think the government is going after him for is his wife. And his wife is Palestinian, and her father lives in Gaza and was associated at one time with the political wing of Hamas. So this is a guilt by association, which is really horrific. And she is a U.S. citizen.
I think we should thank you. It's so fabulous to have you with us, Chip Gibbons. And like Medea said, we could talk for hours, and you have so much knowledge, historical knowledge that will help us as we move through these very perilous times. We do want to get to our calling, we call it a calling party where we take action. So let's unmute and thank Chip for joining us.
Thanks, Chip.
Thank you so much.
Thank
Chip.
you, Chip.
Thanks, Chip.
For your work.
That was great.
Thank
Thank
you,
you.
Chip.
Thank
so
you.
much.
Thank
you.
you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chip.
I need all the help we
Amazing. Thank you.
My red
Yes,
box.
thank you.
Thank you, Chip.
Yes, we appreciate you. So at this point, we're going to move to our action portion of CODEPINK Congress.
Could I have mine?
You have a phone, yes. All right, so please, if you have a phone, take out your phone. If you want to send a message on a computer to your representative, that's fine too. Grace Siegelman, thank you so much for navigating the tech with us tonight. She's going to post the script in the chat on the screen. Basically, what we're asking our representatives to do is to speak out to free pro-Palestine students. So, hello, my name is so-and-so. I'm your constituent, and give the zip code and the city. I urge you to tell Secretary of State Marco Rubio and Secretary of Homeland Security Kristi Noem to free pro-Palestine students who are being held in detention centers only for peacefully supporting Palestine. This is a violation of free speech and due process, and we all have a stake in protecting the constitutional rights of everyone living in this country. So that's what we're going to do for the next 5 minutes. See if we can make at least one phone call to a House rep or a senator who represents you.